I have concluded that this battle for the Democratic nomination will not be successful.
It's official. This November, Joe Biden and Donald Trump will face off to determine who's going to be the next president of the United States. If you're a left-leaning voter like me, then choosing between candidates is usually pretty easy. If the name has a D next to it, you vote for them. Even if you don't know a single thing about the candidate in question, Democrats are generally better than Republicans. Take one look at the presidential candidates' platforms and the rule seems to hold true. Joe Biden outflanks Donald Trump to his left on every issue. Despite running as the candidate who will return the country to normal, his platform is the most progressive in history. For anyone who cares about healthcare, poverty, the environment, criminal justice, or people in general, the choice is clear. But here's the thing. I'm not dumb. You're not dumb. Comparing platforms is probably the laziest way to distinguish among candidates, because politicians lie a lot.
Develops weapons of mass destruction.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
Instead of looking at the carefully crafted list of platforms rubber-stamped by political operatives, a better way to know who candidates are is their record. And that paints a whole different story. Both Joe Biden and Donald Trump have dealt with a catastrophic economic crisis during their time. In 2008, the housing market crash led to a global recession, the likes of which we hadn't seen since the 1930s. And in 2020, well, you don't need me to tell you about what's going on now. In response to the recession in 2008, Team Obama spent trillions trying to stimulate an economy that had gone stale, but the bill was ineffective. A disproportionate amount of the money went to bailing out the banks, who were criminally liable for getting us into the recession in the first place, instead of into the hands of the millions of Americans that had lost their jobs and homes. This meant a lot of the money wasn't stimulating the economy as promised. Secondly, the bill was simply too small. The White House was far too shy about spending the money they needed to save the economy, and because of this, recovery lagged years and years after the collapse. The bill wasn't authored by Biden. Instead, he took on the role of the behind-the-scenes implementer of the recovery bill. Lovingly titled Sheriff Joe, he made sure no dollar went misspent, and he did a pretty good job at that. Only about 0.5% of the funds went to fraud or were misused, which would be a good thing, except the country was dealing with a crisis a century in the making, and the government needed to spend lots of money very quickly. Biden slowed down a response that was already too small, all in the name of fiscal discipline. This was nothing new for Joe Biden, as he's been closer to conservatives than progressives on the topic of government spending ever since he became a politician. By the 1980s, Biden called himself a fiscal conservative, and when Reagan entered the White House in 1981, Biden stood right alongside the conservative president, voting for every tax cut and bill that cut government aid to essential programs. Sometimes Biden outdid Reagan, like in 1983, when the president proposed a budget freeze to cut the increasing deficit that his own tax cuts had helped create. Biden thought that he could one-up him, and along with 2 Republican senators, proposed an even more conservative freeze that included tax to Medicaid and Social Security. But that was in the 80s. We don't have to go so far to uncover his conservative escapades. In 2010, the country was still recovering from the crisis. Biden served as Obama's chief negotiator when striking a tax deal in Congress. And in December of that year, they reached an agreement. They extended former President Bush's tax cuts on top of passing a flurry of other tax cuts worth billions of dollars. House Democrats, even conservative ones like House Whip Steny Hoyer, all opposed extending the tax cuts. Biden had to resort to outright lying to his party to get this version of the bill on the floor. Allegedly, he didn't mention the tax cuts were on the table when briefing Democratic leaders. Senator Bernie Sanders famously gave an 8.5-hour filibuster to stop it from passing.
exactly why I am in opposition to this.
But eventually, enough Democrats gave in and voted yes. In the debt negotiations that followed, Biden continuously suggested cutting funding for Medicare, Social Security, retirement funds, and even food stamps, despite the disapproval of his Democratic colleagues. Outside of the context of a crisis, Biden is in lockstep with Republicans on economic issues. And within the context of a crisis, he's potentially worse. Let's do a thought exercise for a second. If he was currently the president, would his response really be any different to Donald Trump's? Judging by his history, not really. We'd still get trillions of dollars in bailout money to corporations and meager offerings to working people, except under a Biden presidency, we probably wouldn't even be receiving our $1,200 stimulus checks. Instead, Biden would have likely chosen the side of Democratic leaders like Nancy Pelosi, who opposed the Republican proposal because it gave too much money to too many people. His website suggests he'd take the means-tested approach where only small segments of the country get relief, never mentioning direct payment without adding where needed right after, which in the world of politics would mean only very few people would get support and they'd have to climb a million bureaucratic hurdles to get it. Biden also showed he was willing to endanger the lives of voters to score political victory during a crisis. Before the Wisconsin primary in April, Biden told voters going to vote in person was perfectly safe, despite experts everywhere warning about the danger of doing so during a health crisis. Not a good look, Joe. Shifting gears a bit, there's a reason the Democrat starling Barack Obama waited until the race was over to endorse Joe Biden. He's a conservative. The reason he was on the Obama ticket in the first place was so Democratic voters would have a white, non-threatening face when voting for the first black president in history. It was a wink and a nod that nothing is going to fundamentally change. The sitting VP to the first black president joined politics by opposing the civil rights movement. He fought with Jesse Helms to undo the desegregation efforts won on the back of black Americans.
But it seems to me you must recognize as well the hard truth of our condition. The bitter but honest truth is that for a decade, our cause has been stalling. And we all know in our hearts that we've made some mistakes. For when our priorities were access, accommodation, education, and voting, we triumphed. All America stood with us. However, in the last decade, we allowed the agenda to drift from these goals. Busing and quotas became the priorities.
He didn't only wage war against black Americans on the school ground, he also waged war by locking them up in the war on drugs. He voted to expand criminally disastrous policies, from eliminating parole to harsh mandatory minimums and sentencing disparities for crack and coke. Biden authored many of the premier war on drug bills that constituted the mass incarceration effort. He proudly stood with white supremacists and didn't apologize for ruining millions of lives up until 2019. In his defense, he has tried to walk back some of the policies, voting for the Second Chance Act in 2008 that provides counseling to former prison inmates. But it's not enough to make Biden stand out over Donald Trump, who in 2018 signed the mild First Step Act, which has helped over 3,000 people get released from prison due to good behavior. When it comes to criminal justice, much like the economy, it's a wash between the candidates. So sticking to the theme of dumping on minorities, we have to talk about immigration. From racist comments, a border wall, caging children, and turning ICE into his personal political police force, it'd be hard to be worse on immigration than Donald Trump. But there's a reason his public showings have been constantly hijacked by immigration activists.
Vice President Biden.
Joe Biden built the anti-immigrant state that Donald Trump now controls. From 1965 to the late 80s, a broad bipartisan support for immigrant-friendly policy in Washington existed. You had hardcore Republicans like Ronald Reagan granting millions of undocumented people amnesty in 1986, and bleed blue Democrats like Ted Kennedy fighting to halt deportations for certain immigrants in 1990, both laws that Joe Biden voted for. As immigration became a sharper political issue in the 1990s, Biden started to have a shakier record. He had a few good moments, like allowing a documented woman who suffered domestic abuse to petition for citizenship. But for every good moment, there's been heaps of awful ones. In 1983, Joe voted to keep the Reagan travel ban on HIV-infected immigrants, handing the newly elected Bill Clinton his first political defeat. In 1995, he voted for the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, which, besides just being a precursor to laws like the Patriot Act, legalized fast-track deportations, mandatory detention of immigrants for minor offenses, and the use of indefinite detention for non-citizens. Due process? Not for old Joe. In 95, he voted for the ICFRA, which ballooned the size of border enforcement and required the development of what would become E-Verify, the employment verification system that makes it really hard for undocumented people to find jobs. He even voted to ban undocumented people from being able to use Medicaid. He even argued for sending the military to the border, something that Donald Trump would do years later. That's not even to mention his role under Deporter-in-Chief President Obama, whose immigration policies are very similar to Trump's. A 2014 lawsuit filed by the ACLU alleged that children held by ICE were deprived of medical treatment, shackled, sexually abused, and forced to drink toilet water by border agents. Under the immigration policy Biden himself oversaw. Things only get more complicated as Central America becomes more destabilized due to destructive US foreign policy that Joe Biden also crafted, but we'll get there. The point being, more and more people will continue to show up at the southern border. What will Joe do about it? Because frankly, I don't care whether you call us integral to the country or a dangerous criminal, the only thing that matters is what you do. And in that regard, no matter who you vote for in November, the kids will be staying in their cages. Joe Biden argues that Donald Trump has committed irrevocable damage upon the United States standing on the global stage. America needs to lead again, he says. But maybe we're better off without the US leading the charge if Biden's record is anything to go off of. Military intervention is the name of the game for Joe. I can't go into every country he's been in support of military action against, so I'll let this map show you instead. And here's every single US military intervention during Joe Biden's political career. Not only has he supported nearly every military operation during the past 40 years, he's also an enthusiastic supporter of Obama's Counterterrorism Plus, which has wrought horror and devastation across the Middle East. The World War III memes were scary, no doubt about it, but a vote for Biden is a vote for a slow inch to potential nuclear war. Biden has been a consistent supporter of encroaching upon Russia's sphere of influence by expanding NATO, baiting the country into an extended provocation. And while the country is inching leftward on the issue of Israel and Palestine, Joe Biden is Israel's biggest supporter in Washington. Trump has been a terrifying figure on the global stage for his unpredictability. But Biden is predictable to a dangerous fault. His presidency will continue the United States' oppressive and destructive policy abroad. Pick your poison. We've heard it again and again. Donald Trump is the biggest threat to democracy since Watergate. Democrats are frothing at the mouth about Russia and Putin. And while I agree on principle, old Joe isn't any better for democracy. You see, Donald Trump isn't a very big threat to democracy because we don't have one. We have a plutocracy. And don't ask me, ask Princeton University. The central point that emerges from our research is that economic elites have substantial independent impacts on US government policy, while average citizens have little or no independent influence. And in this system of legalized corruption, Biden is just as bad as Donald Trump. Biden was the senator of Delaware, known as the corporate capital of the world. The majority of Fortune 500 companies are incorporated in the state because it's a tax haven. It's our local Cayman Islands. And that's in large part due to Biden's influence in the state. His entire political career is constructed off the back of Wall Street. Between 1990 to 2007, Biden received $6.87 million from the finance capital sector, and this has continued throughout 2020, with Biden receiving $10.1 million so far from that same sector. Now that Biden has solidified his place as the nominee, this number is likely to balloon into the 100 millions. Once in office, there is no way Biden won't pursue the corporate agenda he's pursued over his entire political career. And this presents a grave danger to what little democracy we do have. Take the recent allegations against Biden. The New York Times, the paper of record, took 19 days to report on the story, waiting until after the primary race was over, and edited the story upon the request of the Biden campaign. Meanwhile, the paper didn't wait at all to publish the stories on the allegations against Trump or his Supreme Court Justice nominee Brett Kavanaugh. Biden has the support of the institutions that lead the country, making him incredibly dangerous. Trump isn't any better, essentially having a whole TV network dedicated to praising him, but that's the point. Both presidential candidates represent only meaningless, politically constructed differences, and a vote for either is a loss for the American people. Legitimizing this election with a vote is sacrificing the most vulnerable among us for what? I'm not sure if I'll be voting for Joe Biden this November, but I'll let Joe Biden try to convince you. This is what he said in a banquet fundraiser filled with Wall Street billionaires. The truth of the matter is, you all know in your gut what has to be done. We can disagree on the margins, but the truth of the matter is, it's all within our wheelhouse, and nobody has to be punished. No one's standard of living will change. Nothing would fundamentally change. I need you very badly. I hope if I win this nomination, I won't let you down. I promise you.